Hello, friends. This is David Turner. I'm talking today with my friend John Harvey. John is professor of New Testament and head of the PhD studies at Columbia International University in South Carolina. John was very patient to work with me on a previous project on the exegetical guide series with Kregel on interpreting the Gospels and Acts. And I'm happy to speak with him today about his new commentary in the Kerux commentary series on the book of Acts. So there it is. So here's the book we're talking about, and we hope you'll look at it carefully. So John, welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's good to speak with you today. Could you start by just telling me about how your history with this book and this project began?
Sure. This goes back a long way. You probably remember Jim Weaver. And I was talking with Jim about another project and heard about the Kerux series. He said, well, we're not quite ready for that. And that the project took a long time for them to get it in place because they wanted to get all the pieces in place. And so finally they got things going. And then Herb Bateman took over for Jim at Kregel. And Herb was in the vicinity and made the mistake of visiting our university and talked to everyone he could find and lined up all different kinds of folks for different projects. And it happened to be that Acts was open. And so I said, sure, I'll take that one on. So it was a long process going together. What the series does is pair an exegetical author with a homiletical author. And so Dr. Dave, well, he's not yet Dr. David Gentino is a fellow teaching elder in the PCA. He pastors a church here in town. He's one of our graduates. He's an excellent communicator, an excellent commentator, excellent preacher. And I said, Dave, what do you think? And he said, that'd be great. And so he actually, as he was writing his sections, took the opportunity to preach his way through Acts. And he said he felt like he was plagiarizing himself the whole time because he was bringing back together. But I listened in on his podcast, a couple of those. He just did a great job. So that was the way the thing went together, talking first with Jim, then with Herb, getting in place, and then getting David on board.
Okay. So David is an alum of Columbia, right?
He did his undergraduate with us, and then he did his MDiv at some other some other seminary elsewhere. I forget where exactly. And I think he's working on a DMin with us now.
Oh, great. Well, I've never met him, but I did read up a bit on his bio, and it sounds like he's done a lot of international church planting work and still involved in, I believe it said, training others to plant churches.
Yes, he and his wife were, I believe, in India for a number of years. And that also because it connected well with the cross-cultural aspect of Acts and everything else. And he's on the Mission to North America committee of our local presbytery. So he's still involved in church planting and getting the gospel out and those kind of things. So he's really, he was a very providential choice. He fit well with what we were doing.
Good. Well, it seemed like his experience and gifts would just fit really well with the work in Acts.
Yeah.
How could you do better than a church planter who was doing it cross-culturally? I mean, that's pretty much what's going on there in Acts. So great, interesting. So you alluded briefly to the shall we call it genre or the purpose of the Kerux series with the dual authors. So could you sort of describe how the Kerux series in general and your book in particular fits in the, shall we call it a spectrum of commentaries from the highbrow ones to the warm your heart kind of commentaries?
Okay. Well, it's definitely not highbrow, and maybe there's a little heartwarming going on. I'm not sure. But the basic idea is that for every passage, there is an exegetical idea, a theological idea, and a homiletical idea, because the commentary series is intended for preachers and teachers. And so the way David and I worked is I would do the exegetical work, establish the exegetical idea, usually, well, always a one sentence. Here's what the passage is about. And then from that, principalize that, move that to a theological idea. And then he would take that information and pick up and run with the homiletical aspect of things. So we were always aiming for a one-liner, if you will, something like for Acts 1, where they're choosing Matthias, God's mission requires leaders who are qualified, sanctified, and unified, or something like that. So we were always aiming for that kind of one-line homiletical aspect. And the readers can use that or not, but it was just a way of saying, okay, we start out looking at the text exegetically, then we try to bring it together theologically, synthesis, and then say, okay, how then can we take that and communicate that idea, that the exegetical and the theological ideas for people today, and how to do it creatively. And so it's not quite 600 pages. So it's not there's a series out there where every chapters 1 to 2 are like 2,000 pages, 2,000 pages, something like that, and it goes into great detail and a lot of different things. What I tried to do with the exegetical part was make sure we were tracking the narrative and then talking about some of the important exegetical details. Is this what kind of aorist, or how does this work, those kind of things. And then there are all kinds of sidebars and footnotes, well, not footnotes, sidebars and textual analysis things to let us chase different rabbit trails. So what we were trying to do the whole way through is say, okay, how can we take this text, understand it, and then communicate it as effectively as possible, and help other folks be prepared to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So you're not trying to compete with Craig Keener's multi-volume encyclopedia on Acts.
No, we are not.
Okay.
But we're hoping to go a little bit farther than the little half-inch summary overviews.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it is a challenge to write a commentary that is supposed to be conversant with scholarship and list different views of issues, and at the same time write a continuous narrative of your understanding of the book you're writing about. And my thinking has been formed in many ways by what Calvin said in the preface to his Romans commentary about a commentator should strive for clear brevity.
Yeah.
I think spicua brevitas or whatever. And so the job they assign you with these commentaries today, that is a challenge, because you're trying to show awareness of current exegetical trends and recent scholarship, while at the same time your main task, while you don't want to be ignorant of what's going on, your main task is to present your understanding of what this book of the Bible was about. And you can sort of you can lean to the side of the scholarship or lean to the side of your exposition. And I always thought it would probably be better to lean to the side of your understanding of what's going on in the book, because there are other people who are writing these huge critical commentaries that are, you do lose sight of the forest for the trees in those books. But I'm happy for their work with the trees.
My wife got tired of seeing commentaries piled up under the coffee table in our living room, because I was grabbing all the current stuff and checking to make sure I was doing this and that and the other thing. Said, I will be so glad when we have leg room under the coffee table again. But you're right, it's a challenge. But the great thing about the series is there's a one-page overview at the beginning. And part of that, again, is the exegetical idea, the theological idea, the homiletical idea, and then preaching pointers to try to get you thinking about how this works. And then at the end, after all the exegetical work, there's a theological synthesis, which is a great opportunity. What I chose to do was say, okay, this passage, what Luke is trying to do narratively in this passage is this, to try to connect all the details up with the big picture. And then what he's trying to do theologically is this. And then David ran on and say, okay, so let's take that narrative and theological aspect and then figure out how we can communicate it effectively. So the series fits, the series format fits really well with the way I work anyway. But it was just really helpful to have that kind of three-step process. So you could do all the details, but then you also were forced at the end to say, okay, so what? So it was kind of like the what, the so what, and the now what.
Yeah, that sounds, to my mind, a great format. So in the process of writing a commentary and these types of things, I'm sure it took you in you would measure the time in probably in years, not in months, to write this large tome. So how has as I've heard the expression before, how has your mind changed and how has it remained the same about Acts? Okay. And how has the writing of the commentary impacted your life and the way you think about being a prophet at Columbia?
Yeah, thanks for asking. For what it's worth category, it took about 2.5 years or something like that. So we were actually a little bit ahead of contract schedule somehow, but it was it was one of those, okay, what paragraph can I tackle tonight kind of thing. And that's kind of, you know that from your Matthew commentary, you kind of, here's the chunk and let's work on that. So I think that, and you had already suggested, I think, about that. So that was really helpful. There were a number of things that it wasn't so much confirmed my thinking, but let me work out in detail some of my thinking, like the whole idea of, we tend to think of Acts in terms of geographic expansion, and there's also a cultural expansion that goes on as well, which I'm sure you understand, you know well, but it just gave me an opportunity to think through, okay, what is the significance of the gospel going from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the Ethiopian to those kind of things, and then on to Asia Minor, and then Greece, and then Malta and Rome. And so that was a really helpful process for me to think through the cultural expansion. Another was just, it was just kind of a fun aspect, was I had done a little bit of work before on Pauline chronology, and back years ago at University of Toronto, John Hurd, who was one of my instructors, was a big one on Pauline chronology. So it gave me an opportunity to think through that and refine my thinking there. I don't know that much changed, but it just was more like a refinement on things. One of my colleagues.
Yeah, by the way, I liked how you handled the Galatians, folding that into Acts. I haven't studied that one for quite a while, but you ended up where I always thought was the better position, and so I think you must be right.
Oh well, thank you. Then that's what counts. But there were a lot of those like older issues that I was familiar with or had encountered in doctoral studies, or the one or two times I taught Acts along the way. Just an opportunity to go back and rethink those and rework those, and it crystallized a lot of thinking. The one that was one aspect that was something I really hadn't thought about before was the structure and the content of the speeches. And so this was an opportunity to work on that in a lot more detail. And I really hadn't thought about Paul as evangelist in chapter 13, and then Paul as missionary in chapter 17, and then Paul as pastor in chapter 20, and then Paul as apologist in 22, 23, 24. So that was a really helpful exercise for me to think through how are these speeches organized? How are they structured? What are the common elements, and how does Paul take those common elements and contextualize them to the different situations? So that was a fun exercise as well.
Cool. Yeah, I think, obviously the speeches are huge in Acts, and the way in which Paul speaks in the synagogue at Antioch in chapter 13 versus the way he speaks to the Athenians in chapter 17. Same message essentially, but very different development of the argument and the content. And interesting how that, you could say, gives us a model for reaching out cross-culturally today.
And then how he took the same information and presented it to the Roman government authorities as well, when you get with Felix and Festus and Agrippa and all those kind of things. So it's just that I personally learned a lot. I don't know that it changed my thinking, but I think hopefully it deepened my thinking about those kind of things.
Yeah, I have to say, the putting Paul the apologist into the mix with Paul in the evangelistic settings earlier in the book, that I think is an interesting way to do it, and very helpful. And being a gospelist guy, I have to think about how Jesus told the apostles, when you go out there and you're being called on the carpet for your faith, persecuted, don't worry about what you're going to say. The Holy Spirit will give you what you're going to say. And apparently that's what we have in Acts with Paul there in the later chapters.
I think for me, the big takeaway, the really big takeaway, and again, it's not necessarily a new way of thinking, but it's something I really hadn't thought about. One of my former colleagues, Bill Larkin, when he did a commentary on Acts as well. So I felt like Bill knows everything about Acts. Who am I to be writing about Acts? But in his commentary, when he gets to chapter 14, which is the whole Lystra, Derbe, travel back, report to Antioch and everything else, the series, he wrote that God is the hero of this. And that just stuck with me, that we tend to want to focus on Peter and Paul and Philip and Stephen and all those guys, but God's really the hero in here. And what kept coming back to me so many times, Luke writes with the little Greek word "de." It is necessary. It is necessary for this to happen. It is necessary for that to happen. It shows up in the speeches all over the place. It's all about God helping his mission go forward. And so that whole idea of God as the hero of Acts, I would really love the opportunity to try to track that down, with the heroes of Acts being the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. And so that was for me, that was probably the biggest takeaway from the whole process is who's in charge here, and what is really necessary to happen, and how does God foreordain and pre-work and make all these things work out so it's just exactly what he wants to happen. For me, that was really the big takeaway.
Yeah. Well, along that line, I can't help but sort of riff on that a bit and ask you what you think about how Luke ties Acts back to the gospel in the preface, and refers to the former work that he did about all that Jesus Archomide began to do and teach. And he sort of digresses a bit there, but I'm wondering if there is sort of an implicit my former work was about what he began to teach. This work is about what he continues to teach.
Oh, definitely.
In other words, that just as the Spirit came on Jesus at the baptism in the Gospel of Luke, so the Spirit comes on the church. So in a perhaps less obvious way, Jesus is the main protagonist in Acts, just as he is in Luke in literary terms.
Yeah, and just as Jesus made a journey to Jerusalem, Paul makes a journey to Jerusalem. That's what all
Yeah, yeah.
that 21 to 26 is about, and those kind of things. So, and it's not. I think, yeah, Luke says explicitly what Jesus began to do and teach, and I think implicitly he's saying, okay, now we're going to show you what Jesus continues to do and teach.
Yeah.
And the other thing that, again, Bill Larkin helped me think about a lot initially was the whole pre-ascension conversation that Jesus has with his disciples, with the apostles. Is, and I think there you have the essentials of the gospel. It's necessary for the Messiah to suffer and to die. It's
Mm.
necessary for repentance, for forgiveness of sins be preached to all the nations. It's necessary that you are going to be you are witnesses of these things. You're going to be witnesses of these things. So I think there's that overlap between the ascension in the end of Luke and the ascension at the beginning of Acts really helps tie things together and kind of sets the tone for a lot of the themes that are out there in the book.
Well, yeah. Well, I think my my exposure to Acts early on was primarily uh, through an approach that was using Acts as the historical background for Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And either I wasn't listening, or it, and that's quite likely actually, but either that or uh, the prof wasn't really presenting the idea that Acts was a continuation of Luke. And I recall when it finally got through my thick head that we need to read Acts as an extension of Luke and see the same themes developing there that begin in Luke. That just, I thought, wow, how could I have been so dumb as to not get that a long time ago?
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of themes that run through the Luke Acts book, and it's unfortunate that it's separated by John, because that in the canon, because that kind of helps us. We lose the connection. We think of Acts as over here as something else, but it's really a continuation of what Jesus began to do and teach as he did it through his witnesses. So that was
Yeah.
that was something, again, that was kind of in the back of my head, but it helped me really think through more in detail how the two books go together.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I could bend your ear all day and pick your brain on X, because it's always been a book that I've thought I need to get to that book, but I don't ever get there except to dabble. So I'm really glad to talk to you today about it. But before we wrap this up, let me just ask you. Yeah, I know the book and the whole series. The concept of the series is to bring scholarship to pastors and make it accessible and prompt them, show them one credible way of preaching and teaching the book. So the question is, what is it not only about the way the format of the series works, but the message of Acts? Why should a busy pastor take time to preach through Acts, and why would this book help them do it?
Yeah, thanks for asking. There's so much in Acts about the life and the mission of the church and how God works in both of those areas. And of course, there's the whole conversation, you and I had it before, about narrative, about normative context and in biblical narrative and those kind of things. You just can't pick up, okay, because it happened over here, this is the way it should work now. But there are just so many principles. It's so rich in terms of how the early church lived out its witness, and then how God used his witnesses to extend his mission from Jerusalem, Judea to Samaria, to the ends of the earth, from Hebrew-speaking Jews to Greek-speaking Jews, to on to Samaritans, to the Ethiopian, to pagan Gentiles, to Greek-speaking Gentiles, all those kind of things. There's so much there that we can capture that should inform, I think, the way we live and the way we minister and how we let God do that through us. So, for instance, I happen to be teaching through, surprisingly, probably not surprisingly, teaching through Acts in the Sunday school class right now. And we're doing it in 3 chunks. And part of the reason we're doing the 3 parts, we're doing 1 to 12, 13 to 20, and then 21 to 28, is because there's always been this conversation about where should our focus be? Should our focus be on local evangelism or on world evangelism? And what you see in Acts is 1 to 12, the local and regional evangelism. And then you see the global mission in 13 to 20. And they're both there. They're inseparable. It's like one is the extension of the other, and you have to give balance. You have to make sure you're doing both. And so I think a lot of times the churches can lose track of that balance and say, we're all about reaching our Jerusalem. Well, we were talking again in Sunday school, and I said, do you understand that for the Jerusalem church, Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria is like a 300-mile radius? And for us in Columbia, that's North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and part of Tennessee. And are we having that kind of local regional impact, not just the global impact out around in the folks we support in Japan and everything else? So it's a long answer, short question. There's so much about the life and mission of the church and how God works to do that. I think that's really essential. And then another thing is that I think we in churches can have the tendency to focus either on proclaiming kingdom truth or practicing kingdom care. And I think you see both of those integrated together in Acts. And I think it really can help us keep a balance of caring for the whole person at the same time we are sharing gospel truth with them. So again, I will stop preaching and let you ask more questions.
Well, you can preach as much as you like. What's the old saying? You preach, I'll turn the pages or something. So yeah, I appreciate that, and I think we could go on indefinitely here this morning. I'm really enjoying it, but I think we need to bring it to a conclusion. Is there anything else that you wanted to say about the book that we haven't talked about yet?
Well, naturally, I would say please buy it, read it, and use it. But I think from my side, it was just a really fun and encouraging process and project. And I think both David and I are all about how can we help the church. And so hopefully this can become a tool for a few folks as they preach and teach Acts and think about the life and mission of the church and how God works there. So I think that'd be if I had to tie a bow on this conversation, that's the way I kind of try to tie it.
Okay, well, that's probably a great note upon which to end our conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today about the book, and I certainly would recommend all those who are listening, watching our conversation here to check this book out and use it as a means to teaching your people about how God began his church and how God can still grow his church today through the truth in this book. So
I really appreciate the opportunity, Dave. It's been good talking to you.
You're welcome. Thank you, John.